Welcome back. In 1972, 114 governments met in the first ever global climate meeting that took place in Stockholm. The United Nations Conference on the Human Environment introduced a series of principles that gave priority to climate issues. It was a pivotal moment in time as it influenced international environmental laws. Throughout the decades, these laws have evolved due to geopolitics and perception. I spoke to Claudia De Windt, an international lawyer and expert in the areas of environmental law and human rights.
Stockholm, Sweden, June 12, 1972.
Since the Stockholm Declaration on Human Environment in 1972, environmental laws have evolved immensely.
It approved an Earthwatch program to measure and identify environmental problems on a worldwide scale,
resulting in governments adopting planetary commitments in an effort to clear a path for sustainable solutions.
How would you define environmental rule of law?
Well, that's an interesting question that you pose, because it's something that a lot of people ask. Is it environmental law? Is it rule of law? What is this concept? And it's something that evolved because of the lax compliance with environmental laws, and it's all about accountability. That's what this concept brings to the table when it comes to environmental issues. Having all stakeholders be accountable to laws that are passed in accordance to international norms and the rule of law. And there are different elements to it, which include conflict management, prevention, human rights, participation, and again, accountability, which I mentioned in the beginning.
So when you talk about accountability, where would you say it was when you first entered this field, and where is it today?
I can tell you that the world has changed. People see environmental issues differently. Environmental degradation and climate change are not distant phenomena anymore. We're experiencing the heat waves in some places, sea level rise, hurricanes, and that has brought about a movement from people, from the environmental activist community, civil society, private sector, and all that pressure has resulted in more standards and more accountability. That doesn't mean that everything has been done. There's a lot of work to be done, and there are a lot of challenges. We have many good laws in the books, and we still don't have the level of compliance that we need to have to drive the change that the planet needs for us to be able to live well.
It's so interesting because I can't remember when this was, maybe about 8 years ago. I saw a presentation at the World Bank about the rise of the South, and they described how in China and Vietnam, things that we were already seeing. I mean, China, Vietnam, Brazil, these large concentrations of people where suddenly, the economies are really improving. People who once rode bikes every day now can afford the SUVs, and they look to America and they look at these other places where everybody's driving these big cars. That's what I want. And that's also kind of an ingredient that's been brewing over the last 10, 20 years, which exacerbates the problem in a sense, doesn't it?
For sure. And I think it's important to be cognizant. And this is a concept that has been evolving from jurisprudence, from the courts all over the world. There's a planetary budget. There are limits of what the planet can take and can resist. And I think that we have enough resources and enough planet to satisfy our needs, but not necessarily our greed. So we need to, there's things that need to change in terms of our consumption patterns, what we do every day. If we want to, there's no time. If we want to continue living in a way that it's healthy and that we are not experiencing the challenges that we are seeing every day that are aggravated by other crises altogether, something has to change. Something's got to give.
Claudia was part of the Organization of American States, or OAS, for nearly 2 decades, where she was the head of the Environmental Law and Good Governance section. She negotiated sustainability processes throughout the Western Hemisphere. De Windt holds a master's degree in international legal studies from the American University and a certificate in negotiations from Harvard University School of Law.
Let's talk about Latin America. We had a conversation before we started rolling here. And I know you've done a lot of travel of late, and you were talking about COVID culture, which I'd never thought about, that you go to one country and people have masks, you go to another country, people aren't wearing masks. And when you travel through Latin America, I wonder if there's a different climate culture.
You can't separate culture from climate. I think that that's very important. And if you look at historically, even at French law books from the 1700s, there are connections between the influence of culture in drafting legislation and the connection also between climate and the law. And in Latin America in general, there are different perceptions and different understandings with regards to what is climate change and how environmental degradation is affecting the day-to-day of people. And that has a lot to do with the diversity that we have in cultures and in people. But overall, I have to tell you that the region is a region with a very strong commitment when it comes to the environment, despite the political influences. And I think that has a lot to do with the indigenous communities that we have in the region that have a different understanding of nature and of the interconnection and the relation that we need to have with the planet.
That respect that they have for Mother Earth, in a sense, driving that. So what are some of the perceptions or misconceptions that you have to tackle when you travel through the region? What are some of the things that kind of stand in the way? And where are some areas where you say, wow, we're making progress?
I think that a big challenge is lack of respect for the law. There is sort of a culture from certain sectors of being above the law. And just because we have such a legalist tradition with civil law and all the codification and so on, there is a kind of an understanding that we have all this written in the books, but it's just there. It doesn't necessarily apply to me. Somewhat that is changing today, and I think that it has to do with all those social movements. What we saw in Chile, for example, recently, that resulted in the referendum and a new constitution that's being drafted, including rights of nature and so on. But some of the other challenges that I've had to deal with have to do with different systems of not only legal, but different systems in terms of practice and that perception that you were referring to with regards to nature. For example, in Central America, some of the indigenous communities believe that the god of the Mayans was born out of the river. So for them, the river has a different value than it would have for a mining company coming from abroad and investing, and how that is treated and how that is the value of the river is factored into development and the economy is seen differently.
You mentioned Chile. I noticed recently in Ecuador, too, that a lot of people taking to the streets. Is that one of the things that we should be heartened by, that more people are really concerned about this and protesting and saying enough is enough?
For sure. I mean, when there's a saying in my country that when the river sounds, it's because water is flowing. So there's something brewing behind there. And at the end of the day, I think that the law has to adapt to the climate of the times and has to listen to what people are saying. These are the climate change, environmental issues, and the different crises that we're experiencing today, the financial crisis, the debt crisis, the food security crisis with the war. All those things are affecting citizens, and they're demanding to be heard, and answers should come from different places and the different institutions.
Extreme weather conditions include opposites like droughts and floods. We're seeing examples of these globally, but Latin America is particularly vulnerable. According to a 2021 study by the World Meteorological Organization, deforestation in the Amazon has doubled since 2009, and the Andean glaciers have lost 30% of their masses since the 1980s.
In the Americas, the vulnerable and the disadvantaged communities are feeling the brunt of climate change. What are we seeing there?
This is another challenge that I face in my career in international negotiations related to environment, because Latin America, it's not really responsible for what we are seeing today when it comes to climate change, or the emissions of the region are minimal compared to the impacts that are being experienced, and those impacts affect in a disproportionate way vulnerable population, women, girls, and people living in poverty. We're the most unequal continent or region in the planet still today. So I think that those are some of the issues that are really aggravating, and sorry to use the same word again, but these are aggravating circumstances that are affecting the people of the region. And when you see, for example, things like climate change and certain environmental impacts on water security, on species and biodiversity, they exacerbate and create enabling conditions for conflicts, for example, related to scarcity and access to resources like water, to food. For instance, affecting pollinators can have an implication on food production of a country, and so on. So there's a multiplying effect, and there's a well-known principle in international law that's about common but differentiated responsibility, and the region is very cognizant that it's not the cause of the problem. On the contrary, it can be a big part of the solution, but cooperation from those developed nations that are the most emitting ones is really necessary.
You mentioned the word negotiations. Can you take us inside? What's it like a day in the life with you having to be involved in those kind of negotiations?
Wow, that's a tough one too, because there's so many moving parts at the same time. You have the governments sitting at the table. In most cases, there's, very few exceptions where civil society has a voice that can have an impact in the negotiation. But you have the government making the proposals, but in the room you have, or outside of the room, you have private sector, you have the major groups and civil society, women, farmers that are represented in these major works trying to push forward for their positions. And then you have the asymmetries that are normal and exist. Just an example of it is precisely, you have a country like the United States negotiating with a country like Ecuador or like Peru, where the institutional capacity is different and where the resources are different. You have negotiating teams that have maybe 30 people, and on the other hand, you have a country, a small island state from the Caribbean, that will have 3 people in their negotiating team trying to manage all of these things that are happening at once. And the interests are very, very diverse, even within a same country. So to come and be able to reach compromise, it's tough.
You ever feel like an underdog when you enter into these negotiations? Because I think about businesses have business interests, and their interest may not be, I've got to save the climate. It's, I've got to make a lot of money. And governments a lot of times want to cater to the businesses. So you've got that side of the equation, but then you're on the other side saying, look, we've got to make a movement here. Which makes it kind of tough.
Yes and no, because there's something I have to tell you about my work and what I've done in my career, working first with an international organization. I had to be a neutral broker. I really could not influence the negotiations or the positions of any country. My role was more a supporting role, giving advice to the negotiating process, to the chair or to the countries that were sitting around the table that needed some clarification on certain issues and so on. But what you described is really what happens. And we're seeing it today. There are several negotiating processes that are going now. There's one on biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction that's focused in the oceans. There's one to start a process to negotiate an international treaty on plastics. And for that, a whole negotiating process had to take place before with a lot of private sector groups, so that a resolution could be tabled and could be discussed and finally approved, establishing a roadmap for this process and what the goals are going to be. Are we going to have a life cycle approach to plastics? Are we going to look at eliminating or reducing single-use plastics and so on? What happens with the trade and of plastics, and what happens with the the packaging for the food that we get from delivery in a restaurant? Is it, what does biodegradable mean? So all those dynamics take place even before getting to the negotiating table. And then when you're there, the pressure comes up, because then you have producing countries, then you have countries that are buyers, others that don't have the technology, some that have the technology to reduce, and so on. So it's fascinating.
Claudia is also the founder of the Inter-American Institute on Justice and Sustainability. From Washington, D.C., her work involves building programs that strengthen sustainability and good governance.
For presidential inauguration.
There's so many different areas that somebody as bright as you could go into. What drew you to this career?
Well, I'm an accident in environmental law, like many people in my generation, because I really didn't study this. But I was born in an island next to the sea, and I always just had a passion for nature. I saw it in my grandparents. My grandfather was a Boy Scout. And then, I came to the United States, and one of my professors was working on the general environmental law for my country, for the Dominican Republic. And he found a compilation that I was working on with resolutions, municipal ordinances, for when clients would ask me for legal opinions. And he said, "This is you. You can't go back. You need to help me with this project that we're doing at the OAS." And that's how my career in environmental law started, working on drafting the general environmental law of my country, and then the 4 norms. And then that was going to be like 3-4 months of work, which turned into a career.
Yeah, a lifetime.
Years, yeah.
But you wouldn't change anything about it, would you?
I would not. I think that it has given me the opportunity of meeting such amazing people. Everybody that works on in this field, frankly, somebody that it's driven, that feels a special connection to people, to the planet, and it's been fascinating. I've been able to go to so many countries, see the reality of people, see so many protected areas and amazing scenery. Wouldn't change it for the world.
You've worked with the Organization of American States for nearly 2 decades. So when you first started working there, what your goals were and how you've evolved and how this work has evolved over time.
The interest of countries on these issues has changed dramatically. I think at the beginning of my career on environment, which really started there, countries would see people working in my field as, oh, here come those tree huggers. We need to talk about democracy. We need to talk about human rights. Why are we putting all these technical issues on a political agenda? And that has changed dramatically. Now, all those issues, the pillars of the OAS, which are shared with the UN system of peace, security, development, rights, are intertwined. You can't separate one from the other. You can't talk about climate change without talking about human rights today. There's a recognition of the right to a healthy environment as a fundamental right. You can't talk about development without talking about democracy and the connections with environment. Democracy provides for good stewardship of the planet. That's in the Inter-American Democratic Charter. So I think that there's a serious process of evolution and positive change has taken place. It doesn't mean that more work doesn't need to be done. I think that for diplomats, these are scary topics because there are a lot of disciplines that come together. The fear of being exposed for not necessarily knowing or being the utmost expert, the fear of asking and so on, can be complicated. But I think the change is for the good, for the better.
That dismissive quality of, oh, here come the tree huggers, you have that going against you. And then, I've spoken to so many women leaders. It doesn't matter how much we progressed. You're still a woman entering a room where there's a lot of guys sitting around the table who can be dismissive as well. Can you talk about those hurdles and the difficulties of that and how you overcame them?
I was the first woman in my department to be a section head, a section chief. And most of my colleagues were men, white, older. And I think that for me, that made me work harder. I just knew that I could not afford, I did not have the luxury of not coming prepared to a meeting because I knew I was going to be crushed the minute, I stepped in, and that made me more resilient. And I think, I'm grateful for having that experience, and it has taught me about the kind of leader I want to be, the kind of work environment I want to foster, the opportunities I want to provide women, my colleagues, the people that I'm mentoring, and so on. In fact, the organization that I direct right now, we work on a differentiated gender perspective. That's one of the things and we were 3 women founders, and that's one of the things that we want to focus or work on sustainability, justice, and prosperity on.
What kind of leader are you?
That's even a tough. Do your questions get tougher by the minute? I try to serve. Frankly, I think that. And that's what I want to be. I can't tell you what I am. That's a question that you should ask other people, how they perceive me as a leader. But I would like to lead by example and service and be empathic and be able to understand what other people are feeling and what they're thinking and put myself in their shoes.
Rule of law, we'll finish with a question because before the last few days, you provided us with this report that looked at 10 of the most impactful, really landmark climate cases from around the world. And I think all too often, when we talk about climate, people just feel like it's this crushing realization and, it's coming at us 100 miles an hour. There's nothing we can do about it. But when I look through this report, I mean, you've got case after case, and they're all around the world. It does give you hope. So can you talk a little bit about these cases and in terms of hope, what they mean to you? Well,
what gives me hope is that you read the report. I'll start with that one because that's really important to be cognizant of what is happening out there. And I've had all along the feeling that people think about climate change as something very abstract and very complex. Right now, we are experiencing it. And I think courts are doing a tremendous job at addressing the challenges that are being brought up by the people and looking at the issues. Before, the big thing was we have to find attribution. What is the human causation, the anthropogenic causation of climate change? There has to be we have to follow the rules of evidence and we have to find that causation. Today is not so much about that. Evidence is important, and the law, of course, is what sets the boundary of what a judge can do. But it's about rights, and it's all about people. And I think that that's something to be very hopeful about in all corners of the world, from Argentina to Ireland. We are seeing to China, we are seeing signs of hope, of judges innovating in implementing the law, implementing the constitutions, and respecting fundamental rights of people, the right to a healthy environment.
We're going to leave it there. Claudia, thanks so much.
Thank you.